Now, the Psychological Society of South Africa has launched the first ever practice guidelines for psychology professionals working with sexual and gender diverse people. The guidelines aim to increase psychological knowledge of human diversity in sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, and sex characteristics. For more on this, we speak now to one of the about the guidelines, and I'll speak to one of the authors of those guidelines, and that's Suntosh Pillay. Suntosh, thank you so much for joining us. You are a member of SISA. Firstly, why did SISA feel the need for these guidelines, and also why now?
Yeah, thanks for having me on this morning. The need was quite obvious because, if you look around us in society at the moment, people who belong to the LGBTIQ+ groups are marginalized, they're victimized, they often become victims of hate crimes, for example, and there's also a lot of misconceptions about their lives, for example, and often psychologists lack the competencies to deal effectively with some of the very sensitive issues that might form part of their background stories in their own lives. And so the need for these guidelines arose out of that.
Give us a couple of key guidelines.
So these guidelines, there are 12 guidelines altogether, and each of these guidelines are spelled out in quite a comprehensive document. It's 84 pages long, and each guideline deals with some aspect of competence that psychologists and psychology professionals ought to have. So, for example, about understanding the fundamental human rights that people who are sexually and gender diverse have, the right to non-discrimination, the right to equality. Also things like non-conforming family structures, that people might come from homes where they have two fathers or two mothers. Guidelines around hormone replacement therapy, for example. There are guidelines about how psychologists should be able to identify their own biases, and their own kind of values that might impact on their ability to work with other people effectively.
That's key. Were there complaints that there maybe was some prejudice, some bias coming through from practitioners?
A lot of research has shown that when LGBTI people engage in psychotherapy, for example, one of their chief complaints is psychologists' inability to deal sensitively with matters of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And so there's a lot of research showing that this is an area in which psychology professionals are actually severely lacking. And so SISA, as the nationally representative body for psychology professionals in South Africa, decided that it was high time that guidelines like this are actually put out.
Now, some of the things you just mentioned now, some of those guidelines, they're enshrined in the Constitution. Is there a need now for SISA to come out and say, listen, we need to have these guidelines?
Yeah, absolutely, because I think we know from all areas in society that simply having the laws in place don't actually change practices on the ground. And guidelines are very aspirational. So by creating an aspirational document, we in a way foregrounding what best practice should be within a particular profession. Because we know, for example, that children's rights are protected in the Children's Act and even in our Constitution. But we know in reality, children are still the victims of abuse, of discrimination. In the same way, even though people who belong to sexual and gender diverse groups are well protected in South Africa, because our laws are often world class. But we know on the ground, the realities are very different. And even within psychology, for example, we have a very impressive ethics code that, that people are mandated legally to follow. But even within the confines of that ethics code, people find the kind of shadows and the cracks in that, to actually discriminate against people.
Is SISA diverse? Because we're talking about the LGBTI community, and that community, you find, surely you've got guys coming from Khayelitsha, you've got Uptown as well. Is SISA diverse enough to deal with where the LGBTI community is coming out of?
Yeah, absolutely. I think SISA as an organization, being the nationally representative body, kind of has different segments of society represented, within the society. But SISA also, from its early start in 1994, has always been a unifying body. So it's always about trying to bring psychology professionals together. And I think in my own experience, especially as the chairperson of its Equity and Transformation Committee, SISA has always made sure that the discourse of transformation, and most recently, the discourse of decolonization, is at the forefront of a lot of the work that it does. And part of this work is actually about developing multicultural competence in society.
Yep.
Yeah.
There are many hate crimes committed against the LGBTI community. I mean, we've heard and we've seen, for instance, the unfortunate killings when it comes to the lesbian community in underprivileged communities. What are you doing as SAISA to actually educate our country?
I think the members of SAISA are, like you asked, are they diverse? And the answer is yes. And because of that diversity, SAISA members are spread all across the country, in sometimes even across the world. And in their own capacities, in their own workplaces, they are doing lots of stuff. So, for example, very recently, we've even had a trauma and violence division that has started within SAISA, in recognizing the kinds of difficulties that are experienced in society. And part of this work, even these practice guidelines, comes out of another division called the Sexuality and Gender Division. So SAISA as a body has lots of separate interest groups within it that deal with all these different kind of social maladies that you allude to.
All right, thank you so much, Suntosh. That was Suntosh Pillay, Chairperson for Equity and Transformation from the Psychological Society of South Africa. We'll be back after this break.